Good day. The diversion of a Ryanair flight to Minsk and the arrest there by Belarusian authorities of Roman Protasevich, the co-founder of the Next Telegram channel, a TV channel which has been heavily involved in promoting opposition activity in Belarus, has predictably provoked a huge storm of outrage across the West. Before I get to that, I would like to say a few things about Mr. Protasevich himself, or perhaps less Protasevich, about whom actually I know very little, but more about the Next Telegram channel, of which he was at one point the editor and of which he is apparently a co-founder. Next played an absolutely pivotal role in the protests in Belarus, which took place last year, following the disputed election result, which President Lukashenko of Belarus claimed that he won by 80%, and which was strongly disputed by the opposition led by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is now in exile in Lithuania. Over the last few weeks, there's been a dribble of reports which have appeared on the internet from various anonymous sources, which I strongly suspect are linked to Russian intelligence, which suggest that Next other organizations and NGOs linked with the Belarusian opposition were receiving extensive funding and support from various Western governments, especially those of the United States and Britain. Now, I want to stress I am not able myself to verify this information. You can treat it as disinformation if you wish, but nonetheless, that information has been circulating for some time, and it looks circumstantial and detailed, and I suspect it's probably accurate. So, from a Belarusian point of view, Mr. Protasevich is an important figure. He was a key protest leader during the protests last year. His television channel played a central role in organizing and promoting the protests, and the Belarusian authorities have already declared the Next Telegram channel an extremist organization in Belarus, and they are obviously intent on closing it down and rounding up all the people who are involved in it. Now, I would say that Next is based in Poland, apparently out of Belarus's reach, but obviously, as they've shown with this incident, the arm of the Belarusian authorities is long, certainly longer than Mr. Protasevich imagined, and they are not averse to apparently stopping planes leaving from Greece, flying to Lithuania, and diverting them to Minsk, and having people who are on those planes arrested if they feel that that's an appropriate thing for them to do. I say that, of course, I'm very well aware that the Belarusian authorities claim that the plane was diverted to Minsk as a result of a bomb threat, and they are, as at the time of speaking, sticking by that story. Indeed, they are inviting Western governments and Western experts to go over all the evidence and information they have about that, which the Western governments show no interest in doing. I suppose that may be true, but frankly, I am skeptical. It does seem to me far more plausible that the flight was diverted to enable the Belarusians to get their hand on Mr. Protasevich, and the fact that a MiG-29 fighter jet was also sent up to intercept this aircraft strongly points to my mind in that direction. Anyway, Mr. Protasevich is now being held by the Belarusians, and the latest information we have coming out of Minsk is that he's talking. I say that because there's apparently a video which has been aired on Belarus 1 TV channel, in which Mr. Protasevich says the following: "I am kept at detention center number 1. I continue to cooperate with the investigation, and I'm giving a confession concerning the organization of mass riots after the presidential elections in Minsk. I have no health problems either with my heart or any other organ. I am treated quite well. Well, you can take all that with a pinch of salt. I do, but it does seem that he's under heavy interrogation, and that perhaps wisely he is cooperating to the extent that he can or feels able with his captors. Now, I would add quickly, and that, of course, these protests that took place last year are only part of the conflict between Belarus and the opposition, and it seems Belarus and the West, which we've seen play out over the last year. There were the protests themselves, which ultimately failed to topple President Lukashenko, and which, if we are to believe all these reports that have been coming out from all these anonymous sources about Western backing, look increasingly like a failed a failed color revolution attempt. But we also had that information which was published a few weeks ago by the Russian and Belarusian authorities about an attempted coup attempt in Minsk. That incident, which surely is the key event behind Mr. Protasevich's arrest, is still getting, I notice, no publicity or mention at all in the Western media or on the part of Western governments. They're saying absolutely nothing about it. It's as if that coup attempt was never reported by the Belarusians to have happened, and there's a complete media blackout about every aspect of it. I am obviously in no position to guess what's going on behind the scenes, but I strongly suspect that if there was a coup attempt, which I think is extremely likely, and if Western governments were behind it and were backing it, as also seems likely, and as President Putin of Russia has all but claimed, then Mr. Protasevich is presumably seen by the Belarusians as a person who would have information about that, and presumably that is one of the reasons why he is being held in detention and is being questioned in Minsk. I would add that all those reports which we are seeing appearing on all these anonymous sources, which look like they are essentially confirming or corroborating Western financial support for the Belarusian protests, give me the very strong impression that some intelligence agency, I'm going to guess Russia, has compromised and broken the communications networks that bound all of these protest leaders, the protest centers in Minsk and Belarus itself, and quite possibly the coup plotters together, and that this explains Mr. Protasevich's movements. As my colleague Alex Christoforou and I discussed in a program we've just done about this incident for the Duran, Mr. Protasevich, before he was caught by the Belarusian authorities in this way, was actually attending a meeting, the Delphi Forum in Greece, where apparently one of the main speakers was Jeffrey Pyatt, the US ambassador to Greece. Mr. Pyatt is somebody who, for a very long time, has been suspected by many people as being a person who has a great deal of knowledge and, shall we say, organizational roles in regime change operations. This follows on from the fact that he was ambassador of the US to Ukraine at the time of the Maidan events and the Maidan coup, and that he was caught on the phone talking to the then Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, whilst the protests were underway, and debating with her the future makeup of the post-coup Ukrainian government. So he is somebody that people around the world, certainly in Eastern Europe and certainly in Moscow and Minsk, definitely take a great deal of interest in. And the fact that Mr. Protasevich was attending a conference attended by Mr. Pyatt in Greece and then flew from there to Lithuania, where Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the opposition in Belarus, is based. I can see how some people might have made connections and said to themselves, well, perhaps given that the information linking these various people has been compromised, the communications web has been compromised, perhaps he was providing some information given to him in Greece to the protest leaders in Lithuania, and they might want to know what that was. It seems that Mr. Protasevich was keen to try and conceal a laptop and other information he had on him. I can understand why he would want to do that, by the way, even if he was not carrying any sensitive information. If he's a journalist, he would want to protect his sources, but perhaps there is more to it than just that. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about him. I'm going to now turn to the other big issue, perhaps the main issue in this story, which is the anger and furious complaints which we're seeing from all these Western leaders, all of whom are saying that this arrest of Mr. Protasevich was somehow outrageous and unacceptable and something that should never happen and which is wrong. The reality is that this kind of thing, planes being diverted and people being arrested, has happened before, and it has happened many times. And there's been a good account of this in the Moon of Alabama blog, which has provided a detailed account of recent incidents since the end of the Second World War, where planes have been diverted in exactly that way by Western governments in order to arrest various officials. And I'm just going to read it because, of course, I'm just going to read from what the Moon of Alabama says, because it provides as clear and as precise an account of this sort of thing as I have seen provided by anyone. So we start with an event which took place in 1954. Israel forced down a Syrian passenger plane and made it land in Israel, apparently to gain hostages. This is what the Moon of Alabama says, in order to exchange them for captured Israeli soldiers. A short time later, in 1957, the French authorities did the same. They diverted a Morocco-Spain Air Maroc flight to Algeria's. Algerian independence leader Ahmed Ben Bella was on board. Air Maroc was mostly French-owned, and Ben Bella was jailed in Algiers, but became the first president of Algeria 5 years later. In 2010, the United States wanted to arrest a man who was on a flight from France to Mexico. On US instigation, the plane was diverted to Canada, where the man was arrested and later transferred to the United States. In 2012, Turkey forced down a Syrian passenger plane flying from Moscow to Damascus to search it for weapons. None were found. I remember that incident, by the way. In 2013, US allies shut down their airspace for a flight carrying the Bolivian president Evo Morales from Moscow. The plane had to divert to Austria, where the authorities insisted on searching the plane for the fugitive Edward Snowden before letting it fly again. Snowden was not on board. There's been much talk and discussion over the last few days on social media about that particular incident. There is a searing article by Glenn Greenwald on this very topic, pointing out that this happened in 2013. A plane was forced to land in Austria. The plane of the president of Bolivia, no less, a plane that was not just, in other words, a commercial flight, but one which was covered and protected under diplomatic protections. And that plane was searched in order to try and find Edward Snowden, in spite of the fact that he was protected by all those diplomatic protections. And in fact, that incident, I have noticed, also is completely ignored in Western commentary of this particular incident involving Mr. Protasevich. Suffice to say that I've looked through many articles which have appeared in the British and American media, and I can find no reference to it, despite the fact that social media is all over it with this story and with that particular comparison. And Jen Psaki, the White House spokesman, has been asked about it in the White House during her regular meetings with the media there. Anyway, there was that incident. Then in 2016, Ukraine sent military jets to force a plane flying from Kiev to Minsk to return to Minsk. The authorities were looking for a certain passenger on board who was later found to have been the wrong man. And Moon of Alabama also quotes Petri Krohn, a Finnish journalist and commentator who has discussed how a flight from Russia, which was intended to be diverted by Ukraine in 2020 with the intention of abducting Russian mercenaries on a flight from Minsk to Turkey by forcing the plane to land in Kiev. That particular plot failed. The plane actually stayed in Minsk and was the result of a diplomatic incident, initially between Belarus and Russia, but eventually between Belarus and Ukraine. So, in summary, this sort of thing happens quite a lot. This is not in any way or by any shape or form at all unusual. It's the kind of thing that has happened many times before, and in fact, the point has been admitted in a very interesting article in no less a place than the Financial Times, not, by the way, referring to the fact that planes have been stopped, but discussing US policies. And this is what the Financial Times says in an article by Gideon Rachman, which, by the way, is also referenced in that Moon of Alabama article I was talking about. And this is what the Financial Times, what Gideon Rachman says. The unfortunate precedent set by the United States through its policies of drone strikes and extraordinary renditions during its war on terror raises thoughts. The Americans could point out that this kind of treatment was reserved for those who used or planned actual violence against the US or its allies. But to invert the old saying, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, Belarus had placed Protasevich on a terrorist watch list. Nobody reasonable should accept the Belarusian or Chinese or Russian equation of peaceful dissent with terrorism. But America has encouraged the idea that powerful countries can reach out beyond their borders and grab people. Those powers are alarming even when exercised by the United States, a law-governed country committed to freedom of speech. When they are claimed by one-party states, dictatorships, and assorted strongmen leaders around the world, they are a recipe for a much more dangerous and lawless world. Well, I have to say straight away that Mr. Rachman, in fact, protests altogether too much. He's absolutely right that it's completely wrong and very inappropriate that the United States does this sort of thing, but he does it on a much bigger scale than he admits to. It's not the case that it's only terrorists and people who have engaged in violence that the United States seizes. In fact, there is a widespread practice around the world of the United States putting people on watch lists and arranging for countries that they transit through to arrest those people and then to send them to the United States where they might be facing charges there. That is a regular practice that the United States engages in, and it doesn't simply apply to terrorists and to people who are engaged in violence. I might as well add that not only is it not just people who are terrorists or alleged terrorists who have been exposed to this sort of thing. Many of these people, many people who have been involved in extraordinary renditions by the United States, who have been placed in secret prisons and held without trial. Some of whom have also been exposed to what the United States euphemistically calls, or has called, enhanced interrogation techniques, have turned out to be entirely innocent. And the British government, to its great shame and great disgrace, as confirmed by judgments and decisions of the High Court, has been involved and implicated in the same practice. And in fact, the one country which is pointing all this out with great glee is Russia. And I refer now to certain comments made by Maria Zakharova, the formidable spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, and this is what she says. What is shocking is that the West has described the incident in Belarusian airspace as shocking. The so-called civilized democracy's tendency to follow the quod licet Iovi, non licet bovi, what is permissible for Jupiter may not be permissible for a bull principle, has long been irrelevant because the former leaders have lost leadership skills. The blood and suffering of millions of people across the world have yanked the pedestal from under Western demagogues from where they have been preaching. They should be shocked by everything, including the moves to force down the Bolivian president's plane in Austria at the United States' request, and the Belarusian aircraft carrying an anti-Maidan activist. Otherwise, such behavior should not come as any kind of shock. Well, there we go. I mean, we've discussed in this program so far Mr. Protasevich and why the Belarusians might want him. And we've also discussed why all these claims that we see from Western countries about the unprecedented nature of this incident are, shall we say, economical with the truth. Why are Western governments so angry about this affair? Well, partly it's because of what Zakharova said, and by the way, what Gideon Rachman touches on in his article. Once again, it is coming as a profound shock to Western leaders that things that they do themselves around the world, bringing down airplanes to arrest people, forcing down airplanes to arrest people, kidnapping people around the world and sending them to prisons in the United States and elsewhere, are now starting to be done to people who are aligned with the West by countries that the West regards as hostile. That is a profoundly shocking thing. It is almost an act, as far as the Western powers are concerned, of lèse-majesté, and it is deeply unsettling. Gideon Rachman, in his Financial Times article, talks about the worry that somebody who is now on a Chinese sanctions list has, that if they travel somewhere around the world, visit a third country, perhaps in Asia, the Chinese authorities might arrange for them to be arrested and sent to China, where they might face charges. That's something which people on American watch lists have had to worry about for a very long time. When it happens to people aligned with the West, and quite possibly before long to people who are actual Western citizens, well, one can imagine and understand why Western governments would be alarmed and unsettled and frightened by this. Well, I think there is something else too, and that is that it's becoming increasingly clear that this frantic Western attempt that we've seen over the last year to engineer the overthrow of the government of Belarus, of President Lukashenko, has failed. Firstly, we had those protests, which, it seems to me, one can say with confidence, were heavily Western-backed, and possibly, and very probably, if you believe all these anonymous reports that I was talking about earlier in this programme, might even to some extent have been Western-financed and Western-orchestrated. Then there was this very embarrassing failure of this coup attempt that Putin was talking about recently, and which, as I've said, the Western powers have not disputed in any remotely convincing or credible way. In fact, they've barely spoken about it at all. It's clear, at least to me, that Belarus was targeted in a very concerted way over the last year, and that there is huge frustration and great anger that this operation has failed, and failed completely. The fact that someone involved in it, Mr. Protasevich to be precise, has now been arrested in this way, simply pours salt on the wounds. And it's not surprising that those governments which have been most angry and outspoken about this, including, by the way, the British government, are those which appear to have been most heavily involved in the events in Belarus. So I would add, by the way, that in a program that we recently did on the Duran, we discussed a very strange report, a very bizarre report, published by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, which effectively talked about or called for regime change in Russia, and spoke about President Putin and his government in frankly splenetic terms. What we didn't say in that program is that a large part of that report was in fact devoted to the events in Belarus and spoke about President Lukashenko in almost as relentless and abusive terms as they spoke about President Putin himself. Josep Borrell, in that disastrous visit he made to Moscow back in February, which I covered extensively at the time in various videos for this channel, apparently also trying to bring up the events in Belarus with the Russians, expressing his great grievance and the EU's grievance at the way in which the Belarusian authorities had managed to defeat the protest movement in Belarus, all indicating the great anger that is felt, especially in Europe, about the failure of that particular enterprise. So I suspect that these are the two things, the two main things, the embarrassment and fear that more things like this, to be precise, more things like the arrest of Mr. Protasevich are now likely to happen, targeting people who are friendly or involved with the West and even potentially Western citizens. That is one. And I think that there is also a great deal of anger that the Belarusians have managed to see off the various challenges directed at them. But I think there is a third reason, and I suspect that this is the overarching one, and that is Western frustration and rage that following an incident like this, following the arrest of Mr. Protasevich, following the breakup of the Belarusian protest movement, following the reassertion of control by Mr. Lukashenko, following the drift of Belarus into ever closer alignment with Moscow, there is absolutely nothing the West can do. There is much brave talk over the last few hours over sanctions that the West might impose on Belarus. The sanctions, when they appeared, proved to be, frankly, token and ineffective. The Belarusians are going to simply brush them off. It turns out that Belarus's national airline can't fly to the West, to European capitals anymore. Well, perhaps that's annoying for that airline, and it might be complicated for some Belarusian travellers, but of course they can still go to the West. All this means is that they either have to use a Western airline or they must travel through Moscow. There are also apparently going to be token sanctions against various Belarusian officials, freezing assets these officials don't have and never have had in the West, and preventing them from travelling to the West, where most of them probably don't want to go anyway. These are token sanctions that are completely meaningless. The Russians have already been making clear over the course of the day that they will counter any sanctions that are imposed on Belarus. In fact, the only thing these sanctions are going to do is that they're going to accelerate Belarus's growing integration into Russia and into the Eurasian bloc led by Russia and China. They are, in other words, ineffective and counterproductive. The West has to do them because it has it has nothing else that it can do. Obviously, the option of saying and doing nothing is not one that Western leaders feel politically able to act upon. But ultimately, the sanctions that are being imposed simply expose the West's weakness. Other than that, more serious sanctions, like ones some British officials have been floating, of trying to sanction Russia, of trying to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and all that, well, they're an absolute dead letter. The US administration, at this moment in time, seems to be focused on actually trying to improve relations with Russia, and has been working very hard to try to set up a summit meeting with President Putin and President Biden. I can't imagine that, given that that is the case, it will want to enlarge this and escalate by trying to provoke the Russians through a further round of sanctions over this particular incident, especially not meaningful sanctions which the Russians would notice. As for Nord Stream 2, I think it is inconceivable that the Germans would agree to sanctions like that, and the sanctions announcement that was made over the course of today makes no allusion to that and makes no allusion to Russia. So there we are. It looks as if the Belarusian protest movement has now been defeated. It looks as if the coup attempt against Belarus has failed. It looks as if Lukashenko is fully in control. It looks as if Belarus is going to be increasingly aligned and integrating with Russia. And it looks as if the sanctions that the West is going to impose on Belarus are going to be of minimal significance, and that a further attempt to expand this by sanctioning Russia itself, which some people in London especially are talking about, is a non-starter. This whole incident is yet another further illustration of a point which I've been making in repeated programs now on this channel. The world is changing. The days when the Western powers could do essentially what they wanted, could carry out regime change around the world, foment coups in various countries, force airplanes to land, arrest people and bring them to through processes like extraordinary rendition to secret prisons, expose them to enhanced interrogation techniques, and all the rest. Those days are now passing. The West can still do some of these things, but it was now worry that others can do it to the West also. And that as I said, is extremely unsettling. Regime change operations don't work anymore as they once did. They failed in Syria with the attempt to overthrow the government of President Assad, came to nothing, and they look like they failed in Belarus. The sanctions weapon that the West has been deploying around the world is becoming increasingly ineffective. The reason this is the case is because the balance of power, what the Russians like to refer to as the correlation of forces, is shifting against the West as the Russian-Chinese de facto alliance, strategic partnership, if you prefer, becomes ever stronger and is able to rival and match the West in every form of power: economic, technological, political, diplomatic, and military. And that is something which some Western leaders find extraordinarily difficult to understand or comprehend, and to the extent that they do understand it, it unnerves them and makes them very angry, which is, of course, very what one expects from people who are beginning to become increasingly nervous and increasingly frightened. To be very clear, the key event in the world of diplomacy, which is going to happen this week, is not the arrest by Mr. Protasevich by the Belarusian authorities. There is a minor incident which in a few days or weeks will be all but forgotten. The really key event is the meeting which is now pending between top Chinese officials and Russian officials, including President Putin himself, in Moscow, where a Chinese delegation headed by senior officials of China's Politburo is now heading. That will proceed to deepen that alliance between China and Russia, which is proving so problematic and difficult for the West, and which explains why Western response to the events that have just happened with Mr. Protasevich are nowadays so completely ineffective. Thank you for joining me for this long discussion of this topic. It's obviously one that needs some unpacking. I hope this video has been clarifying. I look forward to you joining me for more programs, both on this channel and our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please don't forget to check out Alex's channel. You find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on our various other platforms: BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. And please also, to the extent that you feel able, support us via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Also, please don't forget to check out our Discord server and to go to our shop and to buy all the amazing things that you will find there: our wonderful magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, and our hats. Lastly, please don't forget to press the like button on this video if you have indeed found it clarifying, and please also remember to check your subscription to this and our other channels. We find lots of people contacting us complaining that their subscriptions have somehow been cancelled. Certainly not anything of our doing, but please make sure that your subscription is still live. Thank you again for joining me for this long program, and have a wonderful day until we speak again. Thank you very much.